The chandelier above the ballroom threw fractured light across 200 champagne glasses, and Naomi Whitfield kept her eyes on the tray in her hands instead of the crowd. Her light blue uniform was pressed to a knife's edge, the white apron cinched tight at her waist, and her shoes made no sound on the marble because she had learned, in 8 months of working inside the Cho estate, that a good maid was never heard until she was needed. She was 20 years old, and she had already buried a version of herself that used to walk into rooms like this one expecting applause. Tonight the room belonged to Jisoo Park, the fiancé of Seo Cho, and everyone in the estate had spent the last 6 days making sure of it. Fresh orchids flown in from Jeju, a 12-piece string arrangement that had played until its members' fingers ached. A grand piano polished until Naomi could see her own reflection warped across the lacquer when she dusted it that morning, before the guests arrived, before the room filled with the particular perfume of old money and older danger. She had not been told to attend. She had been told to serve. There was a difference, and Naomi understood it the way she understood every unspoken rule in this house, the way she understood not to make eye contact with the men who stood near the doors with their hands folded and their jackets cut roomy enough to hide what she suspected they were hiding. She refilled a glass. She stepped back. She became furniture. Seo Cho stood near the piano with a drink he had not touched, and Naomi felt him before she saw him. The way a room seemed to organize itself around a man like that without him doing anything at all. He wore black, unornamented, a suit that fit him like it had been built around his bones rather than bought off a rack, and the only color on him was the ink that climbed from beneath his collar to the edge of his jaw when he turned his head, dark lines disappearing beneath white fabric like a secret the shirt was barely keeping. His eyes were the flat, assessing black of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything a room could offer him. He did not smile when people approached him. He simply waited, and let them do the work of being interesting. Naomi had learned his habits, without meaning to. He drank his coffee black at 5 in the morning, before the house woke, standing at the window of his study with his back to the door. He never raised his voice. When something displeased him, the temperature in the room seemed to drop before he said a single word, and grown men who supposedly ran territories the size of small countries would find reasons to be elsewhere. She had seen him lose his patience exactly once, on a Tuesday in March, when a man named Young-ho had come to the house with blood already drying under his fingernails and a story that did not add up. Cho had listened to the whole story without interrupting. Then he had said 4 words, quiet as a closing door, and Young-ho had not come back to the estate again. Naomi had not asked what the 4 words were. She had learned that the less she knew, the longer she stayed employed, and the longer she stayed employed, the longer her mother's medical bills stayed paid. Jisoo Park moved through the ballroom in emerald silk, laughing at something a senator's wife had said, her hand landing briefly on forearms and shoulders in the practiced choreography of a woman who had spent her entire life being watched and had decided long ago to enjoy it. She was beautiful in the specific, engineered way of someone who had never once doubted that beauty was a form of power, and she wielded it the way Cho wielded silence, as a tool that rarely needed a second application. Naomi had refilled Jisoo's glass 11 times since the gala began, and 11 times Jisoo had looked through her like she was part of the room's architecture. That suited Naomi fine. She had not come to this country to be seen by people like Jisoo Park. She had come because her mother's kidneys were failing in a hospital in Atlanta, and because a piano scholarship she had spent 4 years earning could not pay for dialysis, and because Seo Cho's household staffing agency had offered triple the going rate for someone willing to relocate and keep her mouth shut about what she overheard. She had said yes before she let herself think about what kind of household needed staff who kept their mouths shut. The pianist hired for the evening finished a Chopin nocturne to polite applause, bowed, and stepped away from the bench to take a break, and that was when Jisoo Park's eyes landed on Naomi and did not move past her this time. That was the moment everything changed, though Naomi did not know it yet. You, Jisoo said, loud enough that the nearest cluster of guests turned. The maid. Come here. Naomi set the tray down on a side table with hands that did not shake, because she had trained them not to, and crossed the marble floor with her chin level and her eyes down, the posture of a woman who had learned that invisibility was armor. Yes, ma'am. Jisoo's mouth curved, and there was something underneath the curve that Naomi recognized instantly, a boredom so total it had curdled into cruelty, the specific hunger of a woman who wanted an audience and had decided that humiliating someone smaller than her was the fastest way to get one. "I noticed you looking at the piano earlier," Jisoo said. "Do you play?" It was a trap built out of nothing, the kind Naomi had watched wealthy women lay for household staff a dozen times in 8 months, always dressed up as curiosity, always designed to make the help feel the exact size the room wanted them to feel. "I clean it, ma'am," Naomi said. "I don't play." "That wasn't what I asked." Jisoo's voice carried now, deliberately, and the string quartet had stopped, sensing a better show. "I asked if you play." Naomi felt Seojin Cho's attention shift toward them from across the room, a change in pressure rather than a sound, and she kept her eyes on Jisoo because looking at him now would be its own kind of confession. "I took lessons," Naomi said carefully, "a long time ago." "Perfect." Jisoo clapped once, delighted, and turned to the crowd that had begun to gather with the particular hunger of people who sensed a spectacle forming. "Everyone, I have an idea." She looked back at Naomi, and there was nothing warm in her smile anymore, only teeth. "I studied piano for 11 years in Vienna. I was nearly a concert pianist before I decided I had better things to do with my life." A ripple of laughter. "Cultivated, obedient. If you can play better than me, little maid, I'll give you $10,000. Cash. Tonight." Someone near the bar let out a low whistle. Naomi felt every eye in the room settle on her uniform, on her apron, on the fact of her, and understood exactly what game was being played. Jisoo was not offering a contest. She was offering a public execution dressed up as generosity, certain that a girl in a maid's uniform could not possibly know a full sonata, certain that the humiliation of watching her fumble through scales in front of 200 of Seoul's wealthiest guests would be worth every cent of the wager, because the story would follow Naomi for the rest of her employment in this house. "Ma'am, I really don't think." "I insist." Jisoo's voice had gone flat and final, the tone of a woman used to getting exactly what she wanted the instant she wanted it. "Unless you're afraid." Across the room, Seojin Cho had gone very still, and Naomi caught the shift in his jaw, the faint tightening at his temple that she had learned, over 8 months, meant something was being calculated behind those flat black eyes. He did not intervene. He watched, the way he watched everything, cataloging rather than acting, and Naomi understood that whatever happened next, he would let it happen, because interference from him would mean something to the room that neither he nor Jisoo could afford it to mean. Naomi looked at the piano. She looked at the 200 faces turned toward her, already smiling in anticipation of her failure, already composing the story they would tell at their next dinner party about the maid who had embarrassed herself trying to play Chopin. She thought about her mother's hospital room, the machine that hummed beside the bed, the number on the bill that grew every single week. She thought about the conservatory acceptance letter she had framed, and then quietly taken down off her apartment wall because looking at it made the ache worse. She thought about 4 years of Juilliard-adjacent training that nobody in this room knew existed. For years she had walked away from the moment her mother's diagnosis came in, for years that lived now only in her hands. "All right," Naomi said quietly. "I'll play." The room actually applauded, cruel and delighted, as she crossed to the piano and settled onto the bench had just vacated with a flourish. Someone dimmed the chandelier slightly for effect. Naomi set her hands on the keys, felt the familiar cool weight of ivory under her fingertips for the first time in 8 months, and felt something in her chest crack open that she had spent all that time keeping sealed shut. She did not play scales. She played Rachmaninoff. The prelude in G minor tore out of the piano with a violence that silenced the entire ballroom inside 4 bars, her hands moving with a precision that had nothing to do with lessons and everything to do with 4 years of 8-hour practice days, competition stages, a teacher in Atlanta who had wept the day Naomi told her she was leaving school to take care of her mother. The chords hit like architecture collapsing, and Naomi's whole body remembered what it meant to disappear into music instead of performing invisibility, and for 4 minutes the ballroom of the Cho estate did not exist, only the piano and her hands and the ache in her chest finally finding somewhere to go. She finished on a chord that rang out into total silence. Nobody clapped. Nobody breathed. Jisoo Park stood frozen near the piano with her champagne glass tilted slightly, the liquid inside catching the light, her face doing something complicated between disbelief and fury that she had not yet decided how to arrange into something presentable. Naomi looked up from the keys and, for the first time all night, let herself meet Seojin Cho's eyes across the room. He was not smiling. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a wall he has walked past 100 times only to discover, on the 101st pass, that there is a door in it he never noticed. That, Jisoo finally said, too brightly, into the ringing silence, was a nice party trick. It wasn't a trick, ma'am, Naomi said, standing, smoothing her apron with hands that had gone steady again now that the music had left them. It was Rachmaninoff. A laugh broke somewhere in the crowd, quickly stifled, and Jisoo's face flushed a color that clashed badly with her emerald dress. She recovered fast, the way women trained from childhood to perform composure always did, straightening her spine and forcing her mouth back into a smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes. Well, she said, "Abet is abet." She turned to one of the men by the door, the ones with their hands folded, and something passed between them that Naomi could not read, but that made the hair on her arms rise anyway. Bring the girl her winnings. That was Naomi's first mistake of the evening, though she would not understand it as a mistake until much later. She should have declined. She should have said the bet had been a joke, that she wanted no part of $10,000 pulled out in front of a room full of dangerous men by a woman whose pride she had just publicly gutted. Instead, she stood there in her maid's uniform, breathing hard from 4 minutes of Rachmaninoff, and let herself want it, because $10,000 was 6 more months of dialysis, and she had spent 8 months learning not to want things in this house and had just, in front of everyone, forgotten how. The man returned with an envelope thick enough to make several guests near the door go quiet with a different kind of attention. He held it out not to Naomi but to Jisoo, a small procedural courtesy, and Jisoo took it and turned it over in her hands once before crossing the marble floor to press it into Naomi's palm herself, close enough that only Naomi could hear what she said next. "Enjoy it," Jisoo murmured, her smile ablaze dressed as courtesy. "It's the last easy thing that's going to happen to you in this house." She walked away before Naomi could answer, and the party resumed its noise around them the way water closes over a stone, guests already turning back to their conversations, the string quartet resuming its interrupted piece, the moment folding itself back into the fabric of the evening as though nothing had happened at all. But Naomi felt Seojin Cho watching her still, felt it like a hand at the back of her neck, and when she finally allowed herself to look at him again, he had crossed half the distance of the ballroom toward her without her noticing him move. "Mr. Cho," she said, and dipped her head the way she had been trained to. "Rachmaninoff," he said, and it was the first time in 8 months she had heard him say more than an instruction to her. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying none of the performative warmth the rest of the room used at these functions. "Prelude in G minor is not a piece people learn by accident." "No, sir." "How long did you study?" "For years." "Conservatory track." The words came out before she could decide whether they were safe to say. "I stopped when my mother got sick." Something moved behind his eyes, brief and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "You've been cleaning that piano for 8 months." "Yes, sir." "And you never once played it?" "It wasn't my place, sir." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the weight of it settle somewhere under her ribs, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. "It's a piano," he said finally, "not a shrine. You could have played it whenever the room was empty." "With respect, sir, I don't think Mississippi Park would have appreciated that." The faintest change crossed his face, something almost like the ghost of amusement, gone as quickly as it arrived. "No," he agreed. "She would not have." He did not say anything else. He turned and walked back into the party, and Naomi stood there with an envelope of cash in her hand and the distinct, uneasy sense that she had just become visible in a house where visibility, for someone like her, was rarely a safe thing to be. She found out exactly how unsafe 2 hours later, after the last guests had gone and the ballroom had been stripped back down to marble and silence, when one of Jisu's assistants found her in the staff corridor and told her, without meeting her eyes, that Mississippi Park wanted to see her in the east sitting room before she left for the night. Naomi had learned enough about this house to know that summons like that one rarely ended well, and she was right, though not in the way she expected. The east sitting room was lit low, a single lamp throwing shadows across furniture that cost more than Naomi's mother's entire hospital bill, and Jisu Park sat in a chair near the window with the emerald dress traded for a silk robe and a glass of wine she had clearly not stopped refilling since the party ended. "Do you know what you did tonight?" Jisu asked without preamble. "I played the piano, ma'am. You made me look like a fool in front of the entire Seoul social register." Jisu's voice had lost its cultivated brightness entirely now, stripped down to something colder and more exhausted, and Naomi understood she was looking at the version of this woman that the party never saw. "Do you understand what that costs a woman like me? Do you understand what people will say?" "I didn't ask to play, ma'am. You challenged me." "I challenged a maid," Jisu snapped. "Not a conservatory student hiding in my fiancé's house pretending to dust furniture." She set the wine glass down hard enough that it rang against the side table. "Who are you really?" "I'm exactly who my employment file says I am," Naomi said, keeping her voice level even as something cold moved through her stomach. "A woman who needed a job that paid enough to keep her mother alive." Jisu studied her for a long moment, and something calculating replaced the anger in her expression, a shift Naomi recognized as more dangerous than the fury that came before it. "Seo Jin was watching you," she said quietly. "All night. I saw it. He was watching a scene you created, ma'am." "Don't." Jisu's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't stand there in your little uniform and pretend you don't understand what you did. Men like Seo Jin Cho do not get surprised. Nobody in his life gets to surprise him, because surprise is a weakness and he has spent his whole life making sure he is none. And tonight, in front of 200 people, a maid surprised him." She stood, crossing the room with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who had drunk enough to need to concentrate on walking straight. "I don't know what you think is going to happen because of that. But I would think very carefully if I were you about how replaceable household staff are in this family." The threat sat in the room between them, unmistakable and cold, and Naomi felt the particular fear of a woman with no leverage looking at a woman who had all of it. "I understand, ma'am," Naomi said. "Do you?" Jisu stepped closer, close enough that Naomi could smell the wine on her breath, the expensive perfume gone slightly sour with sweat and anger. "Because I don't think you do. I don't think you understand what family you're standing inside of. I don't think you understand what happens to people who become interesting to men like Seo Jin Cho and then stop being useful to them." Her eyes glittered in the lamplight, something brittle and frightened underneath the cruelty, and for one strange second Naomi understood that Jisu Park was not entirely in control of anything either, that she was performing a kind of power she was not entirely sure she possessed. "Take your money and remember your place. That's the only advice I'm going to give you." Naomi said nothing. She had learned, in 8 months, exactly when silence served her better than words, and she left the sitting room with her heart hammering and the envelope of cash still folded in her apron pocket, and did not exhale fully until she reached the narrow staff stairwell that led up to the servants' quarters on the 3rd floor. She should have known the night was not finished with her. Cho was waiting at the top of the stairs. Naomi startled hard enough that she nearly dropped the envelope, and he raised one hand slightly, not quite an apology, an acknowledgement that he understood the effect of appearing silently in a dim stairwell at midnight. "She threatened you," he said. "It was not a question." "I don't know what you mean, sir." Naomi. Her name, in his mouth, landed differently than she had ever heard it land in 8 months in this house, precise and deliberate, like he had considered the shape of it before he spoke. "I have ears in every room of this house. I have had ears in every room of this house since before you were hired. Do not insult either of us by pretending otherwise." She swallowed, and the fight went out of her posture in a way she immediately regretted, because she had learned that showing him weakness felt dangerous even when he had done nothing yet to earn her fear directly. "She told me to remember my place, sir. That's all." "That's not all." His eyes were unreadable in the low light, but his voice had gone quieter and quieter. In this house, she had learned, usually meant more dangerous rather than less. What else did she say? It isn't my business to repeat what Mississippi Park says in private, sir. Something shifted in his face, and for the first time since she had met him, Seojin Cho looked almost tired, a crack in the composed stillness he wore like armor.
No, he said.
I suppose it isn't. He did not move to let her pass, and she did not move to push past him, and they stood in the narrow stairwell for a long moment with only the sound of the house settling around them, old wood and old money and older danger, all breathing in the dark. You have a gift, he said finally. I have sat in that ballroom for 3 years listening to hired musicians perform pieces they learned to impress people who cannot tell the difference between competence and genius. I have never once, in 3 years, heard anyone play like you played tonight. Thank you, sir. I'm not paying you a compliment. His tone sharpened slightly, though not unkindly. I'm telling you that you made a mistake tonight. Not the piano. The piano was the truth finally getting loose after 8 months of being locked in a room it did not belong in. The mistake was letting 200 people watch it happen. He studied her, and something in his expression made her chest go tight in a way she did not have a name for yet. Jisoo is not wrong to be afraid of what that means. I don't understand, sir. You will. He stepped aside then, finally, enough room for her to pass, and as she moved by him in the narrow stairwell, she felt the heat coming off him, the specific gravity of a man used to being the largest presence in any space he occupied. Get some sleep. Tomorrow will be different. She did not sleep. She lay awake in the small third-floor room she had been given, the envelope of cash tucked under her mattress, replaying the sound of Jisoo's voice threatening her and the sound of Cho saying her name like it belonged to something worth studying, and she understood, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that whatever door had opened tonight in that ballroom was not going to close again just because she wanted it to. Tomorrow was different, exactly as he had promised, though not in any way Naomi could have predicted. She was summoned to his study before breakfast, an unprecedented event in 8 months of employment, and found him standing at the window with his back to the door exactly as she had observed 100 times from the hallway, except this time he turned when she entered, and there was a second man in the room she did not recognize, older, gray at the temples, with a particular careful posture of someone who had spent decades being useful to dangerous people. This is Miho, Cho said. He handles matters of household security. He tells me Jisoo made a phone call at 1 in the morning to her cousin in the organization, asking about your employment file, your visa status, your mother's hospital records. He watched Naomi's face carefully as he said it, cataloging her reaction the way he seemed to catalog everything. I want you to understand what that means before I ask you anything else. The floor of Naomi's stomach dropped out entirely. It means she's trying to find a reason to have me fired. It means, Miho said quietly, that Mississippi Park has connections within this family that could make your life very difficult, very quickly, if she decides you are a threat worth removing. Fired would be the good outcome. Naomi felt her pulse climbing into her throat, the particular fear of someone who had spent 8 months believing that keeping her head down was the same thing as being safe, only to discover overnight that safety had never actually been on the table. I didn't do anything, she said. I played a piano because she made me. That's the whole of it. I know, Cho said. His voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the tone she now recognized from Young-ho's story as the sound of a man deciding something irreversible. That is precisely the problem. You did nothing wrong, and you are in danger anyway because my fiancé cannot tolerate being outperformed by someone she considers beneath her, and because the men she calls family for backup have far fewer scruples about handling problems than I generally allow inside my own house. That was the re-hook of the whole night. The moment the danger stopped being social humiliation and became something with real teeth, and Naomi understood it settling into her bones even as Cho continued speaking, laying out with cold precision exactly how thin the wall was that separated her ordinary life from something far more dangerous. I am not going to let anything happen to you inside these walls, Cho said, and it was not reassurance. It was a statement of fact delivered the way he delivered every fact, without warmth and without room for argument. But I need you to understand the situation clearly. Jisoo has resources. She has family loyalty on her side that I cannot simply override, without consequences that would ripple through this organization for years. What I can do is keep you close enough that removing you from this house becomes more trouble than it is worth to anyone who might consider it. What does that mean, sir? It means, Miho said, with the faint, weary patience of a man who had watched his employer make unconventional decisions before, that Mr. Cho would like to reassign you. Personal staff. His study, his private wing, his direct oversight. He glanced at Cho, something almost like caution in his expression. It is not a request that will go unnoticed by Mississippi Park. You would be under my authority directly, Cho said. Not the household staff rotation. Not answerable to anyone but me. It removes you from the reach of whatever Jisoo is planning, because no one in this family moves against something that belongs to me without moving against me first, and very few people in Seoul are foolish enough to want that fight. Naomi stood in the study with the weight of the offer settling over her, and understood, with the particular clarity of a person facing a decision with no truly safe option, that she was being asked to trade one kind of danger for another, closer, more complicated kind. Staying in the general household staff meant remaining within reach of Jisoo's family connections. Moving under Cho's direct protection meant stepping fully into the gravity of a man whose 4 quiet words had once ended someone's presence in this house entirely, and whose eyes, across a ballroom the night before, had looked at her like she was a door he had just discovered. Why, she asked slowly, would you do this for a maid? Something flickered behind his eyes, fast and complicated, gone before she could read the whole of it. Because 8 months ago, I hired staff to run my household, he said. And last night I discovered I had a Rachmaninoff prodigy dusting my piano and lying to my face about it. Not because you wanted to lie, but because this house never once gave you a reason to think the truth was safe to tell. His jaw tightened, something old and unspoken moving behind the words. I know what it costs to make yourself small enough to survive somewhere. I have spent most of my life doing exactly that in rooms far more dangerous than this one. He paused, and for the first time since she had met him, his composure showed a hairline crack. I lost someone once who deserved better than the smallness this world demanded of her. I am not interested in losing anyone else to it if I can prevent it. The room went very quiet. Miho studied the carpet with the careful attention of a man who had heard something he was not meant to hear and intended to forget it immediately. Who was she? Naomi asked, before she could stop herself. Cho's expression closed, not unkindly, but completely, a door shutting on a room she had glimpsed for exactly 1 second. That is not a story for this morning, he said. Do you accept the reassignment or not? She thought about the envelope of cash under her mattress, about her mother's hospital room in Atlanta, about the particular relief of the Rachmaninoff prelude tearing loose in her hands the night before, for years of buried training finally allowed to breathe. She thought about Jisoo's voice in the dark sitting room, brittle and cruel and frightened all at once, and she thought about the 4 quiet words that had ended Youngho's presence in this house, and understood that whatever safety existed here belonged only to the people close enough to Seojin Cho that removing them meant declaring war on him directly. I accept, Naomi said. Something settled in Cho's shoulders, almost imperceptible, the reaction of a man who had been more uncertain of her answer than his composed face had let on. Good, he said. Miho will handle the paperwork. You'll move your things to the East Wing today. That was how Naomi Whitfield went, in the space of 1 Rachmaninoff prelude and 1 sleepless night, from invisible household help to the personal responsibility of the most dangerous man in Seoul, and she understood, standing in his study with morning light falling across floors polished to a shine that reflected almost nothing back at her, that the piano had not opened a door so much as it had kicked one down, and there would be no closing it, now no matter how badly, in the deepest part of her. Some frightened and practical corner of her still wanted to. The weeks that followed reshaped the geography of Naomi's days entirely. She rose earlier, moved through a wing of the house she had never before been permitted to enter, and found herself, more often than made any sense for a man of his position, In rooms Cho also occupied, handling correspondence he trusted no one else to read, standing quietly nearby during meetings conducted in low voices behind closed doors, learning the particular music of his silences the way she had once learned the particular music of Rachmaninoff, note by note, until she could predict where the pattern would resolve before it arrived there. He was, she learned, a man who thought several moves ahead of everyone in every room he entered, who spoke rarely because he had learned that words given away too easily lost their weight, who ran an organization that controlled territory across 3 cities through the same stillness and precision he brought to everything, negotiations and violence alike treated as problems to be solved with the fewest possible wasted motions. She watched him end a dispute between 2 lieutenants, with 4 sentences delivered in a voice that never rose. She watched him receive news of a shipment lost to a rival faction without his expression changing at all, only his hands, which went very still on the surface of his desk, knuckles pale, before he gave 3 instructions in a row that she understood, later, had ended the careers of everyone responsible. And she watched, too, the moments no one else in the house was permitted to see. The 5 in the morning silence at his study window, coffee black, before the house woke and the machinery of his empire demanded he become someone else entirely. The way his shoulders dropped by half an inch when a difficult call ended, and he thought himself alone. The evening, 3 weeks into her reassignment, when she found him standing over an old photograph in a drawer he had not quite managed to close before she entered with his mail, a woman's face, young, laughing, dressed in an era of fashion that told Naomi the photograph was at least 15 years old, and the way he closed the drawer so quickly it was as though he were trying to outrun his own memory.
She did not ask.
She had learned enough about this house to know that some doors opened only when their owner chose to open them, and she filed the photograph away in the same part of her mind where she kept the sound of his voice saying her name, something she was not ready yet to examine too closely. The danger, meanwhile, did not disappear. It only changed shape, the way Miho had warned her it would. Jisoo's presence in the house grew colder and more surgical with every week that passed, her greetings to Naomi in hallways reduced to a silence, so complete it had its own weight, and twice Naomi caught members of Jisoo's family circle watching her with the particular attention of people cataloging a target rather than observing a stranger. She said nothing to Cho about either instance, because she had begun to understand that every escalation she reported to him resulted in a countermove from him swift and cold enough to frighten her more than the original threat had, and some frightened, self-protective part of her wanted to believe the danger might simply fade if she gave it nothing to feed on. It did not fade. It found her instead on a Thursday evening in late autumn, in the walled garden behind the East Wing where she had taken to practicing on a small upright piano Cho had, without announcement, had moved there for her use 3 weeks into her reassignment, an act of quiet generosity he had never once mentioned or acknowledged as anything but practical furniture placement. She was halfway through a Chopin ballade when she heard the gate at the garden's edge open and looked up expecting one of the household staff, and found instead a man she did not recognize standing in the shadow of the wall with his hands in his coat pockets and an expression that made every instinct in her body go cold and still at once. "You're the maid who plays piano," the man said. His accent was local, but something in the way he said it made her certain this was not a social visit. "Jisoo said you'd be out here around this time. Predictable little routine you've got." Naomi's hands went still on the keys, and she measured the distance to the door of the East Wing, 30 feet, too far to close before he could close it faster if he wanted to. "I don't know who you are," she said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she let show. "You don't need to know who I am." He took a step into the garden, unhurried, the confidence of a man who had done this exact kind of intimidation many times before and did not expect this evening to be any different. "You just need to know that some people in this family think Cho's gotten distracted lately, attached to something that doesn't belong in this house. We think it might be time somebody reminded him what belongs where." "If you have a problem with Mr. Cho," Naomi said, standing slowly from the piano bench, every muscle coiled tight, "you should take it up with Mr. Cho." "Oh, we will." His smile did not reach his eyes at all. "But first I think we take something of his." See how fast his priorities rearrange themselves. He moved fast for a man his size, closing the distance between them before Naomi had fully processed the threat, and she did the only thing 8 months of survival instinct and 4 years of conservatory discipline had ever taught her simultaneously. She grabbed the metal music stand beside the piano and swung it hard into the side of his head as he reached for her, the impact ringing through the garden loud enough that she heard the east wing door bang open a half-second later. Footsteps pounding across stone, and then Cho was there, and the man who had come for her was on the ground with blood in his hair, and Cho's foot pinning his wrist to the garden path with a precision that suggested he had done this exact maneuver more times than Naomi wanted to imagine. "Who sent you?" Cho said, and his voice had dropped into a register Naomi had never heard from him, flat and absolutely without mercy, and the man on the ground made a sound that was not quite words before Cho repeated the question with slightly more pressure on the wrist beneath his shoe, and this time the man gave up a name, choked and fast, a name that meant nothing to Naomi, but that made something in Cho's face go dangerously, terrifyingly still. 2 of his men appeared from somewhere in the dark and took the intruder away, and Cho stood in the garden afterward breathing hard, not from exertion, Naomi understood, but from something closer to fury barely leashed, and when he finally turned to look at her, his eyes moved over her with an intensity that had nothing to do with assessing a threat anymore. "Are you hurt?" he said. It was not phrased as a question.
No.
Her hands were shaking now that the danger had passed, adrenaline draining out of her all at once, and she looked down at them with something like distant surprise. "I hit him with the music stand." "I saw." Something moved behind his eyes, complicated, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her, and some equally complicated part of her wanted him to. He did neither. He stood there in the dark garden with blood on the stone at his feet, and looked at her like she had rearranged something fundamental in how he understood the world. "You didn't wait for me. I didn't have time to wait for you." "No," he agreed quietly. "You didn't." He looked toward the gate where his men had taken the intruder, jaw tight, calculation already visibly running behind his expression, and then back at her, and his voice, when he spoke again, had lost some of its careful control for the first time since she had known him. "This is what I was trying to prevent. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent. It's not your fault. It is entirely my fault." The words came out harder than she expected, edged with something that sounded, underneath the anger, almost like fear. "I brought you close enough to protect you, and instead I made you a target worth this kind of effort. Jisoo's family has decided you're a threat to her position, and they are not people who handle threats with restraint. Then tell me what to do." Naomi stepped closer to him, close enough now that she could feel the tension radiating off him, could smell cedar and something like gun oil beneath it, could see the pulse working fast at his throat despite the stillness he was fighting to hold on to. "Don't just stand there deciding my fate for me. I just hit a man with a music stand. I think I've earned a say in what happens next." Something in his expression cracked open, brief and unguarded, an honesty she had not seen from him in 3 months of watching him negotiate, threaten, and command every room he entered. "You have no idea," he said low, "how rare that is. Someone standing in front of me demanding a say, instead of waiting to be told what to do." His hand came up, slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to step back, and touched her jaw with a gentleness that seemed to cost him something to allow himself. "I have spent 3 years being handled, managed, positioned by everyone around me for their own purposes. You are the first person in years who has looked at danger in my house and picked up a weapon instead of waiting for me to save you. I'm not going to apologize for that. I don't want you to." His thumb moved once along her jaw, barely emotion at all, and his voice dropped lower, rougher. "I have been telling myself for 3 months that keeping you close was a strategic decision. Protection. Nothing more complicated than that." His eyes held hers, and whatever careful mask he usually wore had slipped entirely now, leaving something raw underneath it that made her breath catch. "I was lying to myself." The confession landed in the space between them heavier than any declaration of love could have, and Naomi felt the whole architecture of the last 3 months rearrange itself around the truth of it. Every quiet gesture, every unremarked kindness. The piano moved into the garden without explanation. the way he said her name like it was something worth the careful shape of his mouth. She did not step back from his hand. "I've been lying to myself too," she said quietly. Something shifted in his eyes, dark and certain, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved. The danger of the evening and the danger of this new admission tangled together into something neither of them seemed ready yet to name fully. Then his men returned from the gate, footsteps on stone breaking the moment cleanly in half, and Cho stepped back, composure sliding back over his face like a door closing, though his eyes, when they met hers one more time before he turned to deal with the aftermath, held something that had not been there 3 months ago. "Go inside," he said. "Lock the door. I'll come find you when this is handled." She went inside. She did not sleep that night either. The days that followed moved with a tension that felt different from before, charged rather than merely dangerous, the air between Naomi and Cho carrying the weight of an admission neither of them had taken back, and neither of them had yet acted on further. Jisoo's family, it emerged through Miho's careful investigation, had grown bolder than Cho had realized, convinced that his attachment to Naomi represented a vulnerability worth exploiting before the wedding solidified their own family's position within the organization permanently. The man in the garden had not been acting alone, and the trail Miho followed led, over the course of a tense week, directly back to Jisoo's cousin, the same cousin she had called at 1 in the morning the night of the gala. A man named Taeyong who had apparently decided that removing Naomi from the equation entirely would resolve the problem of Cho's distraction far more efficiently than waiting for the wedding to naturally shift the household's power dynamics in Jisoo's favor. Naomi learned all of this not because Cho told her directly, but because she had begun, in the weeks of her reassignment, sitting in on enough of his meetings that keeping her ignorant had become more effort than simply letting her hear the truth, and she understood, watching him lay out Taeyong's movements to Miho with the same cold precision he brought to everything, that she had crossed some threshold in this house from asset to be protected into something closer to a partner whose judgment he had started, cautiously, to trust. It was Naomi who noticed the discrepancy in the wedding planning documents that Jisoo's assistant had, in a moment of carelessness, left in the study where Naomi now handled correspondence, a discrepancy in the guest security arrangements for the ceremony that would leave one specific entrance to the venue unmonitored during the exact window when the ceremony's most vulnerable moment, the exchange of vows, would occur. "This isn't an oversight," she said, spreading the document across Cho's desk 3 days before the wedding was scheduled to take place, her finger tracing the gap in the security rotation with the same precision she once used to trace difficult passages in sheet music. "This is a door left open on purpose. Someone wants an unmonitored window during the ceremony." Cho studied the document for a long moment, and Naomi watched something cold and calculating settle over his features, the version of him she had learned to recognize as the man who ran an empire rather than the man who had touched her jaw in a garden 3 weeks earlier. "Taeyong," he said quietly. "He's not planning to remove you before the wedding. He's planning to use the wedding itself." "To do what?" "To remove me." His eyes lifted to hers, and something moved behind them that was not quite fear, because she did not think fear was an emotion this man allowed himself in any recognizable form, but something adjacent to it, a calculation running fast and cold. If Jisoo becomes a widow instead of a wife, her family inherits everything through her, and no one questions a tragedy at a wedding the way they question a boardroom assassination. It solves every problem Taeyong has in one move, and it makes Jisoo look like a victim instead of a conspirator, which protects her position within the family regardless of what she actually knew. "Does she know?" Cho was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. "I don't know," he admitted finally, and it cost him visibly to say it. "I don't know if Jisoo is a conspirator or a piece being moved by people who never bothered to ask her opinion. I have spent 3 years engaged to a woman I understand less than I understand you after 3 months." The admission sat between them, weighted with everything neither of them had said outright, and Naomi felt the full shape of the danger settling into focus now, no longer a threat aimed loosely at her, but a plot aimed directly at the heart of the man standing across the desk from her. A man whose 4 quiet words could end a career, and whose hand on her jaw 3 weeks ago had felt like the truest thing anyone had offered her in this entire house. "Then we don't let it happen," she said. "We," Cho repeated, something in his voice she could not quite name. "I'm not sitting in the East Wing while you walk into an ambush at your own wedding." She held his gaze, steady, certain in a way that surprised even her. "I hit a man with a music stand 3 weeks ago. I think I've more than earned a place in this conversation." Something that might, on a different man's face, have been the beginning of a smile moved briefly across his mouth and was gone. "You're not attending the wedding as household staff," he said. "If you're in that room, you're in it as someone I trust to watch my back, and I am not in the habit of trusting people with that particular privilege." "Then don't think of it as trust." Naomi leaned forward slightly, the desk between them, the document with its deliberate gap in the security schedule spread across the polished wood. "Think of it as strategy. You need someone in that room who Taeyang's people won't be watching because as far as anyone in your organization knows, I'm the maid who plays piano and got moved to your study because you felt sorry for her. Nobody is going to flag me as a threat until it's too late to matter." He studied her for a long moment, the calculation behind his eyes visibly shifting from resistance toward agreement, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with strategy at all. "If anything happens to you in that room," he said, "I will burn Taeyang's entire faction to the ground and salt the earth where it stood." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Naomi said. "I've spent my whole life being underestimated in rooms that thought they knew exactly what I was capable of. I intend to keep using that." The wedding day arrived cold and clear, the ceremony venue transformed into something out of a magazine spread. White orchids again, the same string quartet, 200 guests once more assembled to watch the Cho family's next chapter unfold in front of them, and Naomi stood near the unmonitored entrance Taeyang had left open in the security rotation, dressed not in her light blue uniform but in a dark, unremarkable dress that let her disappear into the edges of the room exactly the way she had disappeared for 8 months before a piano had made that disappearance impossible. She watched Jisoo walk down the aisle in white, her face composed into the practiced serenity of a bride performing exactly the role expected of her, and Naomi searched her expression for any sign that she knew what her cousin had planned for the ceremony, and found only exhaustion underneath the performance, a woman who had spent her whole life being positioned by people who never once asked what she actually wanted. Not so different, Naomi realized with an uncomfortable jolt, from the woman Cho had described 3 days earlier, and not so different, in some smaller, sadder way, from the fear that had driven Jisoo to threaten a maid in a dim sitting room 3 months ago. The move came exactly when the security gap predicted it would, during the exchange of vows, when every guest's attention was locked forward on the couple at the altar and the unmonitored entrance at the room's edge would have offered a clean line for anyone willing to take it. Naomi saw the man before anyone else in the room did, a stranger in caterer's uniform moving with a purpose no caterer ever carried, one hand inside his jacket, eyes fixed on Cho's back at the altar, and she moved without allowing herself time to think about it, crossing the distance between them and driving her shoulder into his side hard enough to knock the shot wide. The gun's report cracking through the ceremony a half-second later as 200 guests screamed and scattered, and Cho spun from the altar with a speed that belonged to a man who had spent his whole life prepared for exactly this moment. What followed happened fast, the particular violent economy Cho brought to everything, his men already moving through the chaos with the trained precision of people who had drilled for this exact scenario, and Naomi found herself on the ground with the shooter's wrist locked under her knee and adrenaline screaming through every nerve in her body, holding him down with a strength she did not know she possessed until Cho's men reached them and pulled the man away, his face a mask of fury at having been stopped by, of all people, the maid he had been sent to eliminate along with his primary target. Cho reached her a moment later, hauling her up from the ground with hands that were not entirely steady, his eyes moving over her with a desperate, cataloging intensity that had nothing left of his usual composure in it at all. "You're hurt," he said, and this time it was not a statement. It was fear, raw and unguarded in a voice she had never once heard him use.
"I've fine."
Her shoulder ached where she had driven it into the shooter, and her hands were shaking again the way they had in the garden weeks ago, but she was standing, she was breathing, and the shot that had been meant for his heart had gone into the ceiling instead of into him, because she had refused to be anywhere but exactly where the danger was. He was aiming for you. I know what he was aiming for. His hands came up to frame her face, careless now of the 200 guests still scattering and screaming around them, careless of Jisoo standing frozen at the altar in her wedding dress with her hand pressed to her mouth, careless of anything except the fact of Naomi standing in front of him alive. You could have let my men handle it. You could have stayed back. I told you, Naomi said, her voice breaking slightly despite her effort to hold it steady. I'm done watching from the edges of rooms while other people decide what happens to the things I care about. Something in his face came apart entirely at that, the last of his careful architecture collapsing, and he kissed her in the middle of the chaos of his own wedding ceremony, hard and certain, and entirely without the deniable carefulness of everything that had passed between them until now. And Naomi kissed him back with 3 months of buried want finally allowed to breathe the way the Rachmaninoff had been allowed to breathe on the night this had all begun. They pulled apart to the sound of Miho's men securing the room, Taeyong already being dragged out through the same unmonitored entrance he had planned to use for murder, and Jisoo standing alone at the altar in her ruined wedding, watching the two of them with an expression that held, underneath the shock, something that looked almost like relief. The aftermath took hours to unravel fully. Taeyang's confession, extracted through methods Naomi did not ask about and did not particularly want described to her. The revelation that Jisoo had known nothing of her cousin's plan had been as much a piece being moved on the board as anyone else in the family. Her engagement to Cho, a political arrangement she had endured for 3 years with the same performed brightness she brought to everything, never once given the chance to want something for herself the way Naomi had, that night at the piano, finally remembered how to want. Jisoo found Naomi alone in the garden that evening, the ruined wedding dress traded for something simpler, her face stripped of the composed performance she had worn for 3 years straight. I didn't know, Jisoo said, without preamble, the same way she had opened every conversation between them from the very first night. About Taeyong. I want you to believe that. I believe you, Naomi said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. Jisoo studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. You saved his life today. I did. I spent 3 months trying to make you disappear from this house. Jisoo's voice was quiet now, none of the cultivated cruelty of the gala left in it at all. And you saved the man I was supposed to marry from the family I was born into. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, exhausted and without any real humor in it. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it, Naomi said. It's done. He loves you, Jisoo said, and it was not an accusation, only an observation, tired and clear-eyed. I don't think he ever loved me. I think I was a piece in an arrangement between families, and you were something else entirely. She looked toward the house, toward the lit window of Cho's study where Naomi knew he was, even now, untangling the last threads of Taeyang's betrayal with Miho at his side. I hope you know what you're stepping into. I do, Naomi said, and found that for the first time since the night of the gala, she believed it completely. Cho found her an hour later, still in the garden, seated at the small upright piano he had moved there without ever once acknowledging the kindness of it, and he stood in the doorway watching her for a long moment before he crossed the stone path and sat down beside her on the narrow bench, his shoulder against hers, his presence solid and warm in the cooling evening air. The engagement is dissolved, he said. Formally, as of an hour ago. Jisoo's family has been informed that Taeyang's actions void whatever arrangement existed between our families. There will be consequences within the organization, but none of them will touch her directly. She did nothing wrong except exist inside a family that used her. Good, Naomi said quietly. I owe you my life, he said, and there was nothing performative in it, only the plain, weighted truth of a man who did not offer gratitude lightly. I have spent 3 years building walls around every part of myself that could be used as a weapon against me, and you walked through every single one of them without ever once trying to. I wasn't trying to walk through anything, Naomi said. I was trying to survive a job that paid my mother's medical bills. And now, she looked at him in the last of the evening light, the man who ran an empire through stillness and precision, whose hand had trembled today for the first time she had ever witnessed, who had told her, in a dark stairwell 3 months ago, that she had a gift and made it sound like both a compliment and a warning. "Now," she said, "I think I'm staying, because I want to, not because I have to." His hand found hers on the piano keys, warm and certain, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else at all. The garden quiet around them, the house behind them finally, for the first time in 3 months, free of the danger that had shadowed every hallway since the night a maid sat down at a piano she was never supposed to touch. "Play something," he said finally. "Any requests? Something that isn't for anyone else's audience this time." His thumb moved once across her knuckles, the same careful gentleness he had shown her in the garden the night everything changed. "Just for you. I'd like to hear what that sounds like." Naomi looked down at the keys, worn smooth in places from months of quiet practice no one had ever been meant to overhear, and understood that for the first time since she had arrived in this house 8 months ago, she was not performing invisibility or endurance or survival. She was simply, finally, herself, in a garden that had become the one place in this entire dangerous, glittering world where she did not have to be anything other than exactly what she was. She began to play, something quiet and unhurried, no audience waiting to judge her, no envelope of cash on the line, no danger circling the edges of the moment, only the man beside her listening the way he listened to nothing else in his life, completely, without calculation, and the sound of the piano carrying out into the dark garden like something finally, fully set free. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled us writing it, hit that like button before you go, and if you want more slow burn dark romance dropped straight into your feed, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment below, and tell us what you would have done in Naomi's shoes, sitting down at that piano in front of 200 strangers, because we read every single one of them. See you in the next story.